it. There we go. All right. So again, welcome to Great Decisions. And tonight our speaker is Professor Daniel Cole. He's an internationally recognized environmental law and economics scholar who joined the Indiana University School of Law faculty in 2011. Most of his writings are at the intersection of law, economics, the politics of property, natural law resources, land use, and environmental protection. He has written extensively about Poland and Polish law as well. He may tell us a little bit more about that in a little bit here. He is the author of 7 books and more than 40 articles. His works have been published in England, France, Italy, and China, as well as the United States. He's an award-winning teacher, and he's taught courses including climate and law policy, environmental law, international environmental law, land use, law and economics, natural resources law, property, and property theory. I don't know how you find time to teach all those classes, but congratulations on that. He's a founding member of the Midwest Law and Economics Association and the Society for Environmental Law and Economics. He is a life member of the Clare Hall, which is a college at Cambridge University, and he has served as a visiting scholar in the faculties of law and land economy at Cambridge University. In the fall of 2001, Professor Cole was a John S. Lehman Distinguished Visiting Professor of Law at Washington University in St. Louis. With that, I want to welcome you, Dan, to our program. And maybe we could start a little bit by just asking you to talk a little bit how you got to where you are today. You know, how did you get interested in environmental law, and you know, what brings you to us today?
Well, so I went to law school in Portland, Oregon, a place called Lewis and Clark Law School, which is practically a specialty school for environmental law. I did not go there because I was interested in environmental law. I went there because I thought Portland would be a nice place to live for a while, and indeed it was. But one of the courses I took in my first semester there was a course in natural resources law, and I found it so fascinating that I bought into the entire environmental law curriculum. And I think more than half of my law school credits were in one part of environmental and natural resources law or another. So that's what started me out. And when I eventually went on the market as a entry-level law professor, I was viewed as an environmental law specialist in part. And so that's how I built my career. I taught up in Indianapolis at the law school there for 20 years, starting in 1991, before moving down here to Bloomington in 2011. The main reason for the move here was I was joining it was partly a joint appointment in law school and in the School of Public and Environmental Affairs, but it was mainly for the Ostrom workshop here at Indiana University. I don't know if you've heard of the workshop before, but it was created by Vincent and Eleanor Ostrom. You may know Eleanor Ostrom's name. She won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2009. And I had the distinct good fortune of working with her for several years. Well, after I moved here, it was only another year or so until she passed away, unfortunately. But I'd been working with her up to that point for a while also. So that's my career in a nutshell. I'm now retired. The book count is up to 12, and I'm working on a couple of others as we meet here today. And I think the article count is up to about 70 or 75, and I'm going to be talking about my most recent publication. Just came out finally last week tonight. So thanks for having me. It's a real honor to be presenting to this great group.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us. We really do appreciate it. Maybe we could begin a little bit by kind of setting some ground rules. There was a book written by Garrett Harding a number of years ago called The Tragedy of the Commons. And this was, borrowed from England, I think, in sheep grazing. But, how does this notion of the commons and environment uh, uh, kind of play out today in the world today?
Well, that's a question we could spend all evening on that and many more evenings as well. Um, so it's not just about the environment. It's about all of our social interactions. It's about problem solving. It's about what we call collective action problems. Uh, that is, a collective action problem is any problem that takes more than one person to solve it. It takes some level of social agreement. And so the tragedy of the commons posits that if you have a common resource that's not subject to private property or to state ownership, Hardin's theory was that um, there will be a tragedy. That is, it will be overused because it's in no one's interest to conserve it over time. And that if ever anyone who does decide to try to conserve it, well, other people will just use up whatever that person chose to try to conserve because that person cannot stop them from doing so. It's a commons, as Hardin referred to it, as open to all. Anyone can use it. No one can stop anybody else. So Hardin's solution, he said, well, in order to protect such resources, we need either private property rights or public property rights. Either the government has to restrict access to and use of the resources, um, or a private owner. Well, what Elinor Ostrom received the Nobel Prize for was for showing that Hardin missed a whole category of potential solutions to commons tragedies, which are common property systems. That is, users of a resource, if they're able to communicate and build mutual trust over time, will be able to come up with solutions to their own problems of the commons. The users themselves will come up with access rules restricting their own access and use of the resource to conserve it over time. Uh, so Ostrom didn't deny that commons tragedies sometimes occur, and they certainly do. Uh, but what Hardin missed, because it was basically his presumption that individuals will always act selfishly and will not act in the best interest of the group to conserve resources. And there's a lot of empirical information, historical information that supports Ostrom's position. One of the books I'm working on now is it's a sort of a joint institutional history of the commons and property, going back to prehistory and up through ancient ancient Athens and Rome, into the Middle Ages in Europe and through the modern era. And then I'll be finally, I just finished one chapter on enclosure. I've got one more chapter to write on that, and then I'll be writing about the new commons, which are all kinds of things have been determined to be commons that no one used to think about as commons.
Mhm.
Like a budget is a commons, right? It's a federal budget is a commons for everybody who can get a piece of it, for example. Um, and this is international law also plays into this in that, can the international community actually solve some of the world's problems um, when every country can do whatever it wants ultimately,
Well, so can I stop you there a
yeah,
second?
sure.
So in terms of maybe, is there a conflict between law and economics here? I mean, if we create an economic framework that says the market will solve problems versus having laws put in place to solve problems. Is there a conflict there, or are those um,
It's a
common
sort of
elements in
a,
the same picture?
yeah. It depends on your perspective. Obviously, an ardent libertarian is going to say, leave it to the markets, leave it to private contracting. They can solve all these problems. That's probably not true. Um, then there are people who think it's only the government that can solve all the problems. That's also a dangerous road to go down. You're vesting enormous power in one government, um, uh, and so in fact, Ostrom's Nobel Prize lecture in 2010 was called "Beyond Markets and States." So it's not just markets, not just states. There are also other ways of organizing relations, um, quasi privately, quasi publicly. There are all kinds of institutional mechanisms for helping to resolve collective action problems. And so, far sort of from a, I think, fairly mainstream perspective, most people, I think, still today would say that would agree that markets can't solve all problems by themselves, and in fact, markets can cause problems that we need uh, to balance. And so, government has a role to play in regulating markets, but we also have to be concerned with too much government power. And so it's a matter of balancing and trying to find the institutions that work. And when I use institutions, I use it sort of as a term of art, but it's a very simple one. Institutions are rules. They're the rules that we observe in our daily lives. They include, of course, formal legal rules, but they also include social norms and customs, the ordinary rules of behavior that we tend to follow that allow us to interact socially in a positive way. Um, and so that's really what we mainly study in the Ostrom workshop is institutions, and we engage in institutional analysis to see what sets of institutions seem to work better than others in various circumstances. And there's no one size, is one universal kind of institutional solution that takes care of all problems adequately. The world is a complex place. Human beings are extremely complex actors. We don't just have simple motivations. It's not just about profit. We also have motivations to do well by our family and our neighbors and our friends and so forth. And uh, we need to embrace that complexity a little bit more and not try to take the complex problems of the world and shove them into little boxes that are simple solutions. Um,
Mhm.
yeah,
Okay, well, so to kind of follow up on that, there's a lot of these kind of international agreements
yeah,
that are in place. Many of them are what we might call non-binding or aspirational kind of agreements. In a sense, how does our legal framework in the United States fit into some of these agreement frameworks? Does our Constitution permit us to participate in these treaties and so forth in a binding way or not? Last year we had a speaker talking about the High Seas Treaty as an
mhm.
example, and so that was very interesting. Uh, I guess the high seas would be considered a commons as well,
Yeah, well,
and
absolutely.
yeah. So how does our Constitution and our legal framework in the United States fit into some of these international agreements?
Under the Constitution of the United States, treaties are considered to be, along with constitutional provisions and statutory law, the highest laws of the land. And it obligates us so that when a president signs a treaty and the Senate um, then ratifies the treaty, that obligates the U.S. government to act in accordance with the treaty, including, if necessary, passing new laws that may be required by the treaty. So there's really no ambiguity about how treaties work or are supposed to work under U.S. law. Um, but of course, there's lots of disagreements about what is a treaty as opposed to some kind of more informal bilateral or multilateral agreement or memorandum of understanding. Um, and so you have degrees of formality not within international negotiations um, that are sort of geared to not necessarily trigger all of the requirements of the Constitution. Historically, the U.S. Is a cooperator in international law. Not every country is known as being a cooperator. Russia, for example, is known for being quite non-cooperative, not in the sense that they won't come to meetings and sign agreements. They will. They don't care much about as much about what they sign because whether they follow it or not is not determined by what they sign. Whereas the United States, typically we take the international obligations very seriously, so we're careful about what we sign or do not sign onto. Um, we're not members of the Law of the Sea Treaty yet because we have some disagreements with it concerning deep seabed mining and other issues. We're not party of the International Criminal Courts. Um, and we're about to become a non-party of the Paris Agreement on climate change. Um, it's and that itself that a president, and this happened with George W. Bush when he was president, and with President Trump in his first term, and now already again in his first week as president this time. They make a point of saying we're going to pull out of this treaty. That itself is a recognition of how important the U.S. considers its international obligations.
Hmm. So the UN has got a organization as well. I think our article mentioned that. What is the difference, or what is the goal of that UN body as opposed to like the Paris Agreement and other
Well, the
institutional
UN,
laws? Yeah.
right, the UN has several programs, right? So there's the General Assembly, and then there are all the separate programs, which include like UNICEF, which everybody knows about, the United Nations Refugee Assistance Program, uh, United Nations Peacekeepers. Uh, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change created a set of bodies within the United Nations, the most well-known being the United Nations panel on climate change, which was basically a clearinghouse for climate science and policy around the world. And the Paris Agreement is a uh, is essentially a protocol, an add-on to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change that President, uh, gosh, I think it might have been still George W. Bush. I don't remember if it was Bush or Clinton, not George W. Bush, George H.W. Bush, or Clinton signed it in 1992. I think it might have been early enough that it was Bush, but I'm not sure about that. In any case, so that convention's been around a long time. It's very interesting to note that when George W. Bush or Donald Trump withdraws the US from, say, the Paris Agreement, or in Bush's case, the Kyoto Protocol, they do not withdraw us from the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. We are still members in good standing and will be. So far, President Trump has shown no indication of wanting to leave that treaty. Um, and one of the reasons for that is if he did, the U.S. would have no voice at that table. We would not be allowed in the room for the negotiations. Um, and the U.S. always wants to be in the room.
Well, that brings up another question then. What is the role of the United States if we're withdrawing ourselves from the Paris Agreement? Um, is progress on climate change really possible without U.S. involvement or U.S. leadership in some of these areas?
Yes, in fact, right, for the 8 years of the Bush administration and 4 years of the first Trump administration, that's 12 years, we've not been cooperators on climate change, at least not formally, not within the UN uh, system. That's 12 years out of the first 24 years of this century. So half of this century, we've not been active participants in the UN system. And yet, uh, climate progress has been made, uh, including in the US, very prominently. Part of that has to do with market forces. First, the fact that that price for using the cost of using coal went up relative to the cost of natural gas. And now the cost of natural gas is higher than the cost of renewables. We can't rely on new renewables for baseload power yet. Um, and but so fossil fuel emissions from uh, from electricity generation and from industry in the U.S. are all down uh, consistently over the course of this century. They're also down relative to levels of production. So that is, we're not only emitting less overall, we're emitting ever less per unit of production
Mhm.
than before. Although we're still far and away the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases per capita.
Yeah. So,
Um,
how does this relate to, one of the subtopics of our talk here is national security. How is national security related to this whole climate change environment? Obviously, we could look at some of these natural disasters that have occurred recently and obviously have a huge impact on our economy. But, is there a broader global perspective on national security as well?
Absolutely. In fact, the U.S. Department of Defense has hardly even taken a back seat to the Environmental Protection Agency when it comes to climate change. They've taken climate change seriously uh, throughout this century and even before because they see that climatic change can be an aggravator of issues throughout the world. Right? Imagine average temperatures in the equatorial zone, including the Middle East, are now ranging upwards of over 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Um, People who are already hot under the collar are getting more hot.
Yeah, no pun intended.
Well, pun intended in that case. Um, when uh, millions of Bangladeshis who made a living in the floodplains, well, now the floodplains are inundated, they're underwater, they have no more lives there, their homes are ruined. Where are they going to go? Also, they're going up to Dhaka, the capital, which is in the uplands. How happy are people in Dhaka to receive millions of new um, uh, residents coming from the floodplains, let alone India or other countries that they might go to instead. So the international implications for migration, immigration, which is already, a hot button issue everywhere, including the U.S. Uh, these are problems are going to be amplified uh, by as the effects of climate change continue. Um, so this is, yeah, and it's very interesting. We tend not to focus a lot on the national defense implications, even though the Department of Defense has been taking them very seriously, right? Um, and I'm not sure why, because they are among the most motivating reasons for for a country like the US to be, a leader on climate change. And yet we are, every few years we change political parties in the White House, and that dramatically affects climate policy.
Mm. Are there individual players here that can kind of substitute for the United States? For example, the state of California seems to be very active in terms of
Yep.
advancing climate regulation. How much power do these sort of smaller actors have in terms of moving the agenda forward with respect to addressing climate change?
So just to start with, this was a while ago. Well, um, yeah, I don't know the exact statistic now, but a few years ago, it was pointed out to me that if California was an independent country, it would be the ninth wealthiest country in the world. Um, it would also be one of the leading emitting countries of greenhouse gases in the world. Interestingly, in the history of environmental protection, especially air pollution control, California has been recognized as a leader, including by the federal government. That's why the U.S. Clean Air Act has a special provision in it called the California waiver, which means that California is allowed. No other state is allowed to do it, although other states can now follow the California rule if they want to. California gets to set more stringent standards for air pollution than the federal standards. No other state can set standards more stringent than the US federal standards. And that's in recognition of California's long history of leadership. In fact, uh, if you pay attention to changes in federal emission standards for automobiles, and pay attention also at the same time to gas mileage requirements of the Department of Transportation, the US follows California in lockstep. What the California rule is will become the US rule down the road. And then California will go further still and set a new rule. And then the federal government will follow it again. Now, in the last two last two Republican administrations, so that would be Trump and George W. Bush, the California waiver has become controversial for the first time. It was never controversial under Nixon or Reagan, um, but uh, under George W. Bush and under Trump, they've tried to get rid of it unsuccessfully, and I would expect Trump to try to do it again. But it's going to be even last time he failed to do so, the regulation was thrown out of court. Um, this time it's even harder because this time it was actually written in. It's been basically recodified. So now, not only now is it in the Clean Air Act as it was last amended in 1990. Now it's in the Clean Air Act as it was amended in 2022, as part of the Inflation Reduction Act, the infrastructure bill that passed purely along party lines uh, under President Biden. So that has several climate change provisions in it. In fact, that could well prove to be quite robust uh, in the face of efforts to overturn or to turn back climate regulation in the U.S., including not only by the current administration, but also by the courts.
So this raises kind of maybe an opinion question on your part here. Why has this whole issue of climate change become so politicized? Is this, part of this whole distrust of science kind of thread in the United States, vaccine skepticism, and there seems to be a wider array of this anti-science sentiment in the country, and it appears to be politicized. Is there some underlying reason for that, as far as you know?
Yeah, it's beyond the science being politicized. I mean, the science certainly has been politicized, and that's for reasons that are complex and occur over a longer period of time. It's not only the fault of the conservatives or others, anyone who questions the scientific basis. Um, there have been cases in the past uh, where regulators have followed bad science, frankly. Um, Climate science is good science. It's very robust, and in fact, here's why I say it goes beyond the politicization of science. In I guess it was around 2015, 2016, there was a famous uh, climate scientist at UC Berkeley who was a climate skeptic. His name escapes me off the top of my head. He received funding, a lot of funding, from a prominent conservative group to test this, from scratch, test the scientific basis for claims of anthropogenic climate change, which he proceeded to do over the next year. And when he had redone the science from scratch, he was able to develop a whole center with all this funding he got, a lot of people involved. Um, his conclusion was things are worse than we've been told
Hmm.
by the other climate scientists. You would think that would have put to bed claims that it's a hoax or that the scientific basis is deeply flawed or something like that. But no, they just turn to other sources of potential information against the climate science. So, there are a lot of climate scientists and even some social scientists, and I sort of count myself among their number, who have stopped actively working on climate change issues because it's been very discouraging.
Yeah,
It just
yeah,
it just is. Um, I wrote this paper. This was the first paper when I talked about that. It just came out last week. Was the first paper I'd written about climate change at all for several years, and it's just because it was like you're beating your head against the wall all the time.
yeah. All right. Well, it's kind of a discouraging answer there, but
So sorry about that.
we'll take it here. Before I go on, I have a few more questions. We'll probably go with kind of this prepared uh, questioning for about another 10 minutes or so. But if you have a question, please put it in the chat box. I will kind of manage the chat questions as they come in, and we'll ask them in order. And so when we're done here, we'll turn it over to audience questions. So you can start if you have a question, you want to enter that now. That'd be terrific. Um, so back to this kind of sciencey thing a little bit, and maybe more on economics here. Why have energy companies kind of been slow to adopt green technologies? I know our local utility here, Duke, doesn't appear to be too interested in developing alternative energy production, and huge companies like Exxon, for example, have seemed to pull back from research and development of kind of green technologies in terms of supplying energy.
Uh, Obviously, I can't speak for the motivations of all these different companies, but I will note that there are other energy companies like Entergy that have been on the opposite side, pushing for renewables, yes, but also pushing for nuclear power to supply baseload supply. Nuclear technology has been upgraded multiple times since the 1970s. We haven't built a new power plant, nuclear power plant, although I think one's about to come online or just recently did. Um, and so it's the old energy companies like Exxon. Exxon now has a big push on renewables because they're trying to clean up their act. I wouldn't call it greenwashing necessarily, but they're trying to live down their well-deserved reputation as a information manipulator when it came to like the cigarette companies used to be when government first became interested in regulating cigarettes. Um, but the world is moving. It's almost unstoppable at this point away from fossil fuels as an energy source. Um, Part of it is that getting at the remaining supplies of oil in the ground is more and more expensive. Extraction costs go up while costs of using other energy sources go down. Um,
Mhm.
but no, Duke Power. uh, I'm on uh, one of the regional energy supply companies here, and one of the problems, well, they're recalcitrant in that they send out mailings about climate hoaxes and so forth. Still, um, but part of the problem they face is they sign all these long-term contracts for coal supply, so they don't want to be stuck bearing the costs of contracts that have become worthless.
Mm.
Because coal is no longer usable. Um, there's a standard story, sort of what the economist Schumpeter called creative destruction. Periods of technological change where the old incumbent firms don't know they're big and they've gotten too used to the way things have always been. They're unable to adjust to the new technological realities and therefore tend to fall away. That was certainly the case for IBM and AT&T. Um, and it looks like the coal industry generally, the industry has shrunk greatly. It mainly survives now on producing coal mostly for export to other countries anymore.
Mhm.
President Trump is talking about opening again the Alaska National Wildlife Refuge to oil drilling and gas drilling. Uh, and they could offer to lease to do these oil leases all they want. The question is, is anybody actually going to buy a lease? And
Mhm.
if they purchase a lease, which is basically purchasing a right to drill, are they actually going to do it? Because it's very expensive. And it all depends on relative prices of other fuel sources.
Yeah. All right. Well, it's an interesting issue. I have have an electric car, and get all these notices from these chat groups I'm in that their local utilities have discounts for charging our electric car. Duke doesn't, so it's kind of annoying. But anyhow,
Yeah,
that's a whole different issue.
yeah. I mean, there are places where um, if you have solar generators at home and you produce surplus, you can wheel it back into the utilities lines, and the utility has to pay you
Yeah.
for the power. Uh, Indiana, Indiana's energy policy is favors renewables, but by definition, in Indiana law, coal is considered renewable.
Interesting. You know, always create definitions, I suppose. All right. We have one question here from Rachel. Rachel, are you there?
Sorry, I'm on the treadmill right now. I didn't know that I'd be asking the question, but I'm happy to do that. I am curious how you see our national security being impacted having a Secretary of Defense that does not believe in climate change. I was surprised to hear that our Department of Defense is actually on top of that because I see militarism as a huge contributor to climate change, especially in places like Gaza over the last year or so. Excuse my being out of breath. Thank you for being here and for answering my question.
Sure, thanks for asking it, Rachel. It's a very good question. It's uh, it's getting harder and harder for any person who wants to be considered intelligent to be a climate change denier. The scientific basis is overwhelming uh, at this point, but it's easy to pretend to be a climate denier. Um, One thing, I mean, I don't disagree with you at all about what Eisenhower actually called the military-industrial complex. Um, but one thing that that military leaders tend to be is realistic. They don't like to pretend problems away. And so I that would be why I'm not surprised, I suppose, that the Department of Defense um, has been serious about climate change almost practically from the beginning. They're always looking at all kinds of contingencies that might affect national security. Um, and unlike uh, unlike elected and appointed politicians, um, they feel, at least it seems to me, that military people feel like they can't just ignore problems away.
All right. So we have some hope then, at least for that person.
Well, I think so I don't put personally, and this is also one of the reasons I suppose that I haven't been writing so much about policy for a while, is I sort of reached the conclusion that I shouldn't really expect much from climate policy. Uh, Lawyers and judges and policy experts are not going to solve the climate problem. It's going to be engineers.
Mhm.
It's going to be the development of new technologies. Um, Now, the role policy needs to play for that to happen is they need to create the right incentives for the engineers to work on the new technologies. And we've been getting those incentives mostly right for a while now. Um, and we shouldn't be surprised that it takes time either. So the United Nations panel on climate change only concluded with a high level of certainty that anthropogenic climate change was occurring only at the very beginning of this century. Um, and so, so it's only been about a generation or so that we've had what I would call a sufficient scientific basis really to push the policy hard enough to accomplish something. Yeah, we always want to nip problems in the bud to the extent you can. You would like to avoid costs and then having to adapt to costs. Uh, but policy is, and this includes law as well. Policy is reactive. It's not, it tends, we don't do proactive very well. There have been cases where we've been, I don't know, lucky to have pulled off something that's proactive. Certainly the ozone layer problem could have gotten a lot worse uh, if there hadn't been uh, widespread agreement. And the widespread agreement, of course, depended on the existence of technologies that used less ozone depleting substances. Um, so the we have the right technologies available to us to wean off fossil fuels, um, but it's also no surprise that fossil fuel industries are fighting for their lives,
Mhm. Yeah.
and that's uh, politics is what it is.
All right. All right. I think Claire Collins, you got a question?
Yes, I was wondering how feasible would it be to for California to put their electric lines underground? Because the fires recently, it was believed that the electric system, the above ground lines were causing the fires to spread. And is California a place where you can't put things underground because of the earthquakes? Um,
Yeah, since I'm not a geologist or an engineer, I hesitate to even offer a tentative answer to that question. Are there things that California can do to reduce the risk of such firestorms and the magnitude of the harm that they cause? Probably there are some things California can do. But when the Santa Ana winds are blowing through the canyons at 100 miles an hour, um, if there's any any source of fire at all, there's a substantial risk that it's going to spread far and wide, especially in conditions of drought. This is also, of course, related to climate change. Last time I was in California was January 2023, and we had what I didn't know that what they were called before, but they're called atmospheric rivers. Where just day after day, it's dumping and dumping rain. Um, since then, California's all of a sudden in drought again. After that, I mean, it was coming out of a much longer drought, and so it was only relieving conditions for a while. But uh,
Those Santa Ana winds are so powerful. I lived in California briefly when I was a child, and I was walking home from school one day on the sidewalk, and the Santa Ana winds blew me out into the street. I was 7 years old.
These things can happen. And one of the things that I went to college in Los Angeles, and my senior year of college, I lived in a rented house in Altadena. Um, when I was there, actually, when I was last in LA in January 23, I went up there and took a photo of the house. It's now gone. Um,
Yeah.
and I have still a lot of college friends in and around LA, and been checking in with them recently. There's some bad stories and some happier stories. Um, but you know, when I was looking at for several days, I was watching the LA news channels, just the local news channels because they were 24 hours on the fires. And I was looking at the air, and air quality was terrible throughout the base. And I was looking at it, it reminded me of when I was in college in the mid 70s. You don't see bad air quality like that anymore in
Right.
LA, except when there are these big fires. So some things have gotten better, right?
Yeah.
It's a sort of an amazing fact that as as LA's automobile population tripled, um, air pollution declined substantially.
Yeah.
And that is largely thanks both to the federal law's Clean Air Act as well as California's own regulatory system.
All right. Good. I think Eric has a question. Yeah, there, Eric. He said he had a question. Um, maybe we'll go to Larry. Larry had a question, and we'll come back to Eric if he's still around. Larry,
Yeah,
go
yeah. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about some of the national security and defense issues that relate to climate change, in addition to potential for migration, because low-lying areas are being flooded and people are moving and they need to move someplace. But it seems like there might be other issues like related to the fact that um, producers of the hardware for both solar and wind come from other countries, like China, for example, and they dominate those marketplaces. And then, it seems like the thawing of the Arctic could be an issue because more obviously, you've got ships that can pass closer to us through those straits now. The Northwest Passage opens up in the summer now, and I'm sure that Russian submarines troll it regularly. But are there other issues related to that we should worry about or think about how we can ameliorate?
Well, not to put too fine a point on it, but you may have heard that President Trump wants to buy Greenland. Yeah, and there are national security reasons for that, having a good deal to do with more access to the Arctic, including for mining companies. The Arctic is a potential region of conflict now, um, between just really a small group of countries with Arctic borders, Scandinavian countries, Russia, um, Denmark, Canada, US. Um, and they're all everybody's eyeing it hungrily, seemingly unworried about what's happening with, now that the permafrost is thawing with the release of much more methane into the methane being a fairly powerful greenhouse gas, that's going to aggravate climate change problems in and of itself. But yeah, so you've got so certainly right. I mean, Russia's always been trawling U.S. West Coast, East Coast, certainly around Alaska, always. China is, of course, is as well. Um, so those aren't really new problems, but again, those problems are going to be aggravated by open waters to the north. That's again, this is something I can only assume. I'm not in, I don't involve myself with Department of Defense. Well, they certainly don't involve themselves with me, so I have no idea uh, what planning's going on there with respect to all this. And look, we're going to be spying on Russia from the northern waters as well. Um, but so everybody's looking at potential new economic opportunities from climate change, right? Climate change isn't only a story of cost and harm; it's also a story of new opportunity. Uh, it's not. Usually, people who work on climate change, we're not allowed to talk about that. You know, we can get in trouble with folks to our left if we talk about potential climate benefits at all, and there will be, potentially places that benefit from climate. I mean, the agricultural harvest in Canada is going to explode, you know, for example, whereas the breadbasket in the U.S. is going to struggle uh,
Right.
in the second half of this century.
Okay. Thank you. Dan Foote has got a question.
I have so many, Professor Cole. Thanks for being here. I was trying to it's such a frustrating topic. As you suggested, even climate experts get frustrated, and you said that you feel like you can be beating your head against the wall. At the same time, I sort of drew some optimism on your part when you mentioned the role of the Defense Department, militaries probably around the world dealing with national security issues, and the inevitable rising cost of fossil fuels and the development of new technologies. Where would you sort of leave us, just your own personal opinion, as to whether we are heading in the right direction versus the wrong direction, especially as the Arctic melts and the methane starts to get released, if that's what's going to happen?
Well, you think about uh, this analogy sometimes overused, but you think of the electricity-based economy, right? The fossil fuel-based economy. Think of it as the world's biggest ship, and now it has to turn. It doesn't turn quickly, you know. Takes a long time to turn that thing and move in a new direction. I am, I guess, I suppose by nature, sort of I like to think of myself as a realistic optimist. Humans are are able to create all kinds of problems in the world, for the natural world, for ourselves. Um, we're also very good at solving problems. Uh, human survival on Earth has been a success story of problem solving from the very first. Um, and we have the technology exists, even if to vacuum up lots of carbon out of the atmosphere, to reverse it, exists. It doesn't exist at the scale that we'd need it, and the cost is very, very high. But at some point, as the costs of climate change keep going up, at some point that stuff becomes more feasible economically because we're trying now to reduce huge costs. So it's worth spending a lot more on some solutions. Um, And I'm not, technology's always, not always, but it's mostly politically neutral. It can cause problems as much as it can help resolve some problems. Um, when economists say there's no such thing as a free lunch, they're right about that when it comes to technology. Um, there's I don't remember who said this. There's no single bullet solution to climate change. Um, but there's silver buckshot, you know. And the little individual pieces of buckshot have a lot to do with technologies. Now, you know, we make well, Congress, so every 20 years or so, Congress passes an energy statute which guarantees that um, we'll have viable nuclear fusion within the next 20 years. So, as one of my economist friends puts it, we're always only 20 years away from nuclear fusion,
Right.
you know. But if it ever works, that is kind of the silver bullet, you know. Or if we ever develop, fail-safe rocket technology, we can, shoot off all our waste in rockets just directly at the sun, which is the main nuclear fusion reactor in our neighborhood,
Yeah.
right? Um, but absent, great strides uh, along those lines, yeah, we're going to be, this is what the Ostroms used to talk about polycentric governance systems, which are basically um, units of governance, not necessarily formal governments, but governance at different scales, working on different parts of an issue, different but overlapping jurisdictions, cooperating in part, competing in part. Um, you know, the right. So when the international community agrees on a treaty, the treaty doesn't do anything by itself. The treaty requires that the nation states, the governments, then implement the treaty requirements. The government then of the United States or another country doesn't solve the problem. It introduces regulations or subsidies or does whatever to get the private economy involved, including technological innovators and developers. Um, and it's a process, and it involves all of us. I mean, Lynn Ostrom said, yeah, some kind of global agreement probably is necessary. We need something at the global level, but not just the global level. And we certainly shouldn't wait for government necessarily to do the stuff for us. There's lots of stuff individuals can do. Um, I haven't done everything I can do. I've replaced, most of the lighting in and around my house, but I still use probably too much energy, more energy than I need to have a really nice, comfortable life. Um, you know, uh, so it's it's going to be. We talk about death by a thousand cuts. Maybe we should talk about life by a thousand cuts. We solve problems. Uh, uh, Hillary Clinton, It Takes a Village, or George H.W. Bush, A Thousand Points of Light, right? Uh, we need to uh, believe, if you don't believe that these problems are solvable, um, you're not going to be a very happy person. Not that happiness is everything, but you're going to have a pretty miserable life. Um, at some point, you have to uh, believe that the problems we create for ourselves, we also can solve. And we may not solve them as quickly as we would like, or a lot of other people would like. Um, we may not solve them all at once. Uh, but wholesale changes can also be problematic. Um, you know, piecemeal reforms, piecemeal approaches to problems can often provide more secure, less risky solutions, but take longer to implement over a long period of time. Um, I, I don't, I guess I don't, my frustration isn't so much that everything's taking too long. That's definitely not the source of my frustration. I never expected it that the global community is going to somehow resolve climate problems very quickly. Um, uh, that's that's too much to ask, in my opinion. Um, but I see a lot of humans very actively engaged in the effort. Um, I always believe successful collective action is possible. Right. And sometimes you have to experiment with collective action at different scales. It could be collective action in a neighborhood that does something. Um, you know,
Right. I think Eric figured out how to get unmuted. So,
oh, okay.
yeah, out there, Eric.
Yes, I am. Thank you very much for your presentation. And I just wanted to very much second your um, saying that engineers are going to solve this problem. It was interesting when I read the Great Decisions article on this. There was one sentence throughout that whole 11-page article that talked about Bill Gates and his breakthrough energy technologies initiatives, which I view as a big part of the answer. My frustration with presentation, not your presentation, but general presentations about this, is it seems to come down to clean base energy. Affordable is what we really need and what we're waiting on. And there's things in the pipeline. There's these fourth generation SMRs, small modular nuclear reactors.
Exactly.
And I don't know where that's at. But one thing that rarely I see presented, and this is something governments can do, is in funding basic research like DARPA, and like the massive amounts of leverage you can get out of that. And I think Bill Gates has talked about this before, but I'm not sure, and I don't know if you have any information on our relative levels of where that basic fundamental R&D, the government, it seems to me, can greatly impact this problem. Whether we've funded that enough, or if you have any idea where we're at in that.
Yeah, there's actually a whole interesting history about the funding of climate science in the United States and elsewhere. The U.S. was by far and away the leader in climate science in the earliest days. I'm talking about the 1960s and 70s. The U.S. was way ahead of the curve compared to other countries before it went way behind the curve. Um, there were all kinds of things going on in the federal government, especially on climate science, a lot of funding. That changed during the Reagan administration. Funding for climate science went way down and has never completely recovered in at least to the extent where the US becomes now the clear leader once again in climate science, which is it's it may be a co-leader in climate science now. The interesting point there was that Margaret Thatcher, the chemist's daughter, was extremely interested in climate change. So she dramatically increased British funding of climate science as Reagan reduced US funding of climate science. And then the EU it itself became increasingly involved as the course of the 1990s went on. There is still a high level of funding. In the US, I'm not going to talk about what's going on exactly right now in the federal government with respect to funding because I just don't know, and it's been in court and all kinds of other stuff. So grant agencies in the US, this is certainly true of the National Science Foundation, and I assume it would be equally true of National Institutes of Health and others that provide lots of funding, are risk averse, much more so than they were once upon a time. They're risk averse because they don't want to be seen to be picking losers, right? Remember how much flack President Obama took when his startup solar energy group basically got put out of business by the Chinese, who were producing solar panels that were so much less expensive that the entire industry basically moved from the US to China. And so there's this risk aversion that's arisen. And so what this is my personal sense, a lot of research that gets funded now is researchers who tailor their proposals for what they think the funders want to fund. And in fact, increasingly, the funders put out these calls for proposals that have lots of specifications of what they're looking for. They don't necessarily fund, the brilliant researcher somewhere with a crazy idea that just might prove to be worth something, right? That's what basic science is. Basic science, it's like the oil industry. It's like about drilling dry holes until you finally get one where the oil comes out of the ground, right? And that's what basic science is about. But we've become very risk averse about it, so that there are lots of scientists who tailor the research to get the funds rather than really coming up with novel ideas. But that's just my opinion. And I could be completely wrong about it. I have enough experience with the National Science Foundation. I've been on grants. Never been a principal investigator. I've often been a co-principal investigator, and I've actually sat on review committees that decide to approve grants for the National Science Foundation. And it's an eye-opening experience.
Mhm.
Not always a positive one.
I've read articles stating the same thing that you just said.
Yeah. Yeah. It's in a way to be expected. So and that's where private research funding can do a lot of good. That's what universities used to do before state legislatures dried up all the funding And so that they had to go more increasingly to the National Science Foundation, National Institutes for Health, and so forth.
Dan, I'd like to go back a little bit to the national security piece
Mm.
that we were talking about earlier. If we look around the world and we hear, about the increasing demand for rare earth metals and so forth, how do these other countries like the Congo and so forth protect themselves, from this kind of onslaught of developed countries, kind of exploiting their resources and um, so it seems like from a national security standpoint, a big issue in terms of kind of making sure that these resources become available to everybody on a kind of a fair basis.
Uh, yeah, this is, the new version of colonialism, if you will. It's If history's any indication, there's not much that the Democratic Republic of the Congo is going to be able to do to protect itself from being harvested. Now, that's not to say there aren't things it can do. And in fact, there is some more recent history of developing countries being able to get a better deal from sharing their resources with uh, the biotech industries in highly developed countries. The Biodiversity Convention, signed in 1992, included provisions on what are called farmers' rights. And this is not farmers in our sense. This was in the usual sense of the term. This is about when, say, US or European biotech companies go down to find genetic resources that can be converted, worked up through science into useful products. Um, they used to do it free of charge. Well, now under the Biodiversity Convention, or I think it's that one, they have to share. They have to pay something to the countries whose genetic resources they are mining. And the same thing could be done. I see no reason why it couldn't be with respect to the mining of rare earth minerals. But the funny thing about rare earth minerals is all of a sudden, when we started thinking that they were very scarce and that China was going to have a monopoly on them, all of a sudden we start finding, new supplies of rare earth minerals everywhere
Mhm.
around the world. Um, what turned out to be the case is when they weren't so much in demand, the supply was adequate to meet that demand, but not, much higher demand. Well, now demand's much higher, so we find a lot more of this stuff. It's same thing we do with oil drills. We open up old oil wells to go after the stuff that used to be too expensive to extract, because now we have new technologies and now we can extract it and still make a profit on it, right? So that's sort of what's happening with rare earth minerals. Now, what's happening in Africa that's that's sort of a more general concern, and this is part of that, are the contracting that China has been doing all over Africa, um, where these are very risky contracts. Um, I can't remember which African country it is, but in the last couple of years, I believe China has taken ownership of a port in an African country because they weren't repaying the Chinese loans um, as they had promised to do. Uh, so they are basically contracting where part of their consideration, part of the contract is risking national sovereignty over certain valuable resources that they have. Now, that's not a new story, but this is something that is right now where China seems to be the dominant developed country. I mean, China, we call China a less developed country or developing country, and it is in terms of per capita income, surely. And it's a less wealthy country than it was before President Xi came in and decided to reintroduce communism, full stop. He basically has set the Chinese economy back by his policies for probably 30, 40 years. But they still have plenty of money to throw around at these other less developed countries and pretend that they're their big brother, that they're helping them out. Not that America's not helping; they don't help. You know, we're going to be good to you, and then they take over your port.
Yeah. All right. Well, we have, I think, one more question. Actually, Dan Foote proposed this, but I'll ask it for him. Is there any specific legislation right now that you see that's in danger of maybe getting overturned in the U.S. under the current administration? And maybe just give a kind of a quick analysis of that,
Yeah.
if you could.
So the one I've been thinking about most is the Inflation Reduction Act, the infrastructure bill. And the reason I think about that is because it should be, as I understand it, relatively easy to repeal. Recall it passed on a party line vote, and the reason it was able to pass on a party line vote in the Senate was because the filibuster did not apply, and the filibuster did not apply because it was a budget reconciliation measure, a tax and spend measure. Well, I can only assume that it can be repealed as a budget reconciliation matter just as easily by a Republican Senate majority. And that legislation, it's a huge piece of legislation. It's something like 60 plus different programs, but one of those programs is all about climate change, and including amendments to the Clean Air Act that are a clear response to the Supreme Court's skepticism about treating greenhouse gases as air pollutants under the Clean Air Act. But there's also lots of funding programs for clean energy and climate change more generally. And so that's the one I'd be worried about.
All right. Well, it's 8:30 here, and we promised everybody we'd be done by 8:30. I want to thank you, Dan, for your presentation tonight. You brought up a lot of important issues that I think everybody was very interested in, and you've given us some things to think about. And so we really appreciate you joining us tonight, and we look forward to maybe you joining us on some other programs throughout the year. So, at any rate, if you have any parting comments you'd like to share with us?
No, thank you for inviting me. It's been a real pleasure, and yeah, please do have me back sometime. It would be another pleasure. But thanks everybody for the conversation. I've enjoyed it very much.
Well, maybe in a
Yeah.
few years, we get past the first couple of years of this, if we survive our way through and we see what happens. My apologies for my own camera being off. I didn't realize I slipped into that. This has been fascinating, Dan. Thank you very much. Yeah, this is and we had a good conversation before this that
Mhm.
we may not be dying on the vine with this, but it's going to be a very perilous time.